some amazing work on disinformation. We had the pleasure of talking to her at lunch today about her really interesting mixed methods approach, and I will just turn it over to you. You can take it from there.
All right. Thank you for the introduction, and I'm going to jump in. Let's see, can we see it? I guess we can. It's a little bright. Eventually the sun will go down. So fake news, misinformation, political propaganda, information war. In the last couple of years, we've been introduced to new terms, reintroduced to old terms that attempt to try to describe what we think might be going wrong in our information systems. And I'm going to focus on one subsection of this problem and one term in particular, disinformation. And I'm going to talk about it in the context that we've been studying it, online during crisis events. We've been looking at disinformation for several years now, but we didn't start out with the intent to focus on it. Like many users online these days, we kind of stumbled into it down the rabbit hole. My first line of research, our lab's first line of research, was actually looking at digital volunteerism during crisis events, how volunteers come together and organize to help each other, help people halfway across the world after crisis events happen. And crisis events like natural disasters, man-made disasters, and political protests. In 2013, my collaborators and I set out to examine online rumors during crisis events. And in 2015, 2016, we began to realize that we weren't just looking at accidental rumors and misinformation, but we were looking at pervasive disinformation in some places. And that soon became the focus of our research. I have a few different goals for this talk. My first is to help you better understand what disinformation is and how it works. I want to situate the term in some historical context. I want to provide some recent case studies of online disinformation, and I'm going to use those to correct some misperceptions and maybe add some nuance into our understanding of disinformation. And finally, I'm going to talk about some implications for design, maybe some other things, maybe we can open up the conversation in a couple different ways, the design of technology and platform policy. And throughout, I hope to communicate why disinformation should be a core concern of those who care about secure and trustworthy systems. The first thing I want to do is distinguish between misinformation and disinformation. The differences between the two are especially important when we start to think about solutions. One high-level way to characterize a distinction is simply as a matter of intent. Misinformation is information that is false, but not necessarily deliberately so, while disinformation is intentionally false information. So from a high level, I think this definition works. It's one that I give to my undergraduate students. But in another view, disinformation isn't simply about intent. The term disinformation has other specific meanings and historical context. It's been used to describe a particular kind of political propaganda that's been connected to this term, dezinformacja, originating in Soviet intelligence. Our understanding in our lab of disinformation is informed by the work of Ladislav Bittman, who was a practitioner of Soviet disinformation. There I am. A member of the Czech intelligence, he defected to the United States in 1968 and became a professor of disinformation. Much of what we know about the historical use of disinformation, we actually learned from him. Borrowing from Bittman, we define disinformation as a suite of tactics applied by influence agents to manipulate information spaces to achieve strategic political objectives. It's important to note that not all disinformation, historical or modern, is connected to Russia, but they have been innovators in the space, and we're going to appreciate them for that. And I am going to present 3 case studies of online disinformation, 2 that are connected pretty strongly with Russian influence and intelligence operations, as well as some other countries, and then one that has a bit more tenuous connections, which I'll try to draw out, but may have to talk more about it. These are long-term studies that took place over the course of many years in our lab. And I'm going to look at these from a CSCW or perspective or computer-supported cooperative work. I'm looking at disinformation as a kind of collaborative work between agents and crowds. In our lab, we apply a socio-technical lens of exploring the relationship between social and technical structure and human action. In other words, how technology, social norms, and social behaviors are mutually structuring. We theorize that disinformation is a shaping force within this inherently complex system. And through this lens, we focus on collaborative work that produces and distributes disinformation, studying how diverse and distributed groups of people connect and work together towards various outcomes, intentional and otherwise, and how that activity is shaped by the environments they work within and the socio-technical structures that, in turn, take shape there. And this perspective also informs our methodological approach. Our methods are likely why I'm here today talking about disinformation and why we became sort of early researchers of this phenomenon. Our work builds off of methodological innovation in crisis informatics. Our methods are profoundly mixed. We conduct iterative, qualitative, and quantitative interpretive analysis of social media data and other online content. And what I mean by that is we look at the data from different perspectives, sometimes using high-level quantifications and visualizations to see patterns in the data, and then diving into those patterns and maybe anomalies to see what they mean, to unpack them and understand them. We are not afraid to roll up our sleeves and look at data, analyzing by hand, sometimes thousands of data points, tweets, accounts, things like this. We repeatedly go back and forth between views at 10,000 feet and tweet by tweet. Speaking of tweets, to some extent, all three of our case studies are cross-platform studies, but the seed data for all of them was Twitter data, because that's public. All right, I've started with this, but it's warm in here, so I'm going to take it off. And keep going. All right, so we have three case studies here, and I want to jump into them. So the first case study is on Russian interference in the 2016 US election. In this case, as I mentioned before, we didn't actually set out to study disinformation. Initially, we were studying framing contests in the Black Lives Matter discourse, primarily between Black Lives Matter activists who were advocating against systemic injustice and police violence against African Americans, and a counter movement of conservative accounts that attempted to challenge and denigrate the Black Lives Matter message. This conversation was highly polarized. From data collected related to shooting events in 2016, we generated a data set of tweets that had either Black Lives Matter or Blue Lives Matter in the text. As part of that work, we created a structural graph of retweets from that data. In this graph, each little node or circle is an account, and that account is closer together to other accounts that retweeted each other and further apart from accounts that didn't. These are actually edges there, but the edges are invisible. And so this graph revealed two separate communities or echo chambers on either side of this conversation. There was pro-Black Lives Matter on the left, where most of the accounts were also politically left-leaning or liberal, and anti-Black Lives Matter on the right, where accounts were consistently politically right-leaning or conservative. When we talk about online polarization, this is what that looks like structurally. The two sides created and spread very different frames about police shootings of African American citizens. At times, the discourse was emotional, divisive, and honestly uncomfortable for our research team. We managed to complete this study in October 2017. A few weeks later, in November, Twitter released a list of accounts associated with the Internet Research Agency, or IRA, that was operating out of St. Petersburg, Russia, which was running disinformation operations online during this time in 2016, targeting US populations. And so I saw a link to that list one night on Twitter because I spent too much time there, and I went and I looked at the list of accounts that were associated with the IRA, and I recognized some of them. They had been, some of them had been in our tables of the most influential users, and some of their tweets had been in our text of examples of some of the content that people were sharing around the Black Lives Matter conversation. So I sent this list over to my students, who thankfully aren't always hanging out on Twitter at night, and asked them to kind of take a look. And what they did was they systematically ran the IRA trolls against this graph to see where they appeared in the graph. And this might not surprise you now, but it surprised us then. It's that the trolls were actually on both sides of the conversation. So in this account, the troll accounts are in orange, and their retweets are orange kind of edges in the graph. And it shows that the Russian disinformation agents were active on both sides of the Black Lives Matter conversation. A few were among the most influential accounts in that conversation on Twitter. An orange account on the left was retweeted by Jack at Twitter and me. Several orange accounts on the right had integrated into other grassroots or possibly astroturfed online organizing efforts on the conservative side. And so they were part of that as well, both in this conversation and some others. So my PhD student, Emmer Arif, conducted an in-depth qualitative research on the accounts in orange. He found that the IRA accounts enacted multidimensional online personas across platforms that played on stereotypes of African Americans on one side and white US conservatives on the other. They were impersonating activists and also modeling for others what online activism looked like, reflecting norms, but also to some extent shaping them. Often their content wasn't superficially problematic or any different from what other in the spaces were doing. They were tweeting about support of strong Black voices on the left or support of US veterans on the right. In other places, they were sowing and amplifying division. Some of their content was among the most vitriolic content in the space, advocating for violence against police on the left and using racial epithets on the right. In a few places, we can see them holding arguments for themselves, like a puppeteer having one of their accounts on the right fight with one of their accounts on the left. We now have a much more complete view of the IRA activity. In 2018, through their Project Sunlight, Twitter released all of the tweets related to their IRA accounts that they'd identified. In total, they found more than 3,000 accounts that were part of their operations, and those accounts had sent about 3 million tweets in English, so a lot of activity. This is a temporal graph of their activity. We have tweets, tweet volume here, and retweet volume in the darker gray. What's interesting here is that early on, and there's actually some tweets here too that I cut off because there was nothing going on. Early on, they're not getting a lot of retweets or follows, not much is happening. But around the fall of 2000, actually it's around the spring of 2015, they begin to pick up. They start to establish personas. About 300 accounts began to establish particular kinds of personas. In fact, the kinds of personas that we'd accidentally seen in our other conversation. They were enacting very specifically African-American Black Lives Matter activists and US white conservative political activists. There were 2 of their 4 personas. They had 2 other types. But when they began to enact these personas, their accounts started finally to gain traction, to get retweets and follows. Of all their accounts, they had 3,000 accounts. There's about 300 dedicated to the activity of the kinds of accounts that I showed you. And nearly 85% of the retweets that the IRA accounts ever received in total were retweets of those 300 accounts that were associated with the political personas that we showed you. In other words, the IRA trolls, or the disinformation operations, weren't most effective, they were most effective not in spreading fake news, but in infiltrating online political communities. Stepping back, we can see this as a multi-year campaign to infiltrate and shape political discourse in the United States, orchestrated by a group with ties to the Russian government, and we can see them burrowing into and working within, and in some cases working with, an otherwise organic online community. We can categorize this activity as orchestrated, which is going to contrast with some of the examples that are going to come up. It was coordinated by a single organization inside a building in St. Petersburg. We don't know much about how they worked. We have a few accounts that people have told us about, but we can assume that it was formally organized. And this is going to get a lot messier as we move into the next case study. So our second case study, and I'm sorry I have to go really fast through these because we would like the time to reflect and kind of let it sink in, and I'm going to jump right into another context. The second case study looks at disinformation during armed conflict. Since 2017, we've been conducting research on online discourse related to the civil war in Syria. In particular, in this research, we focused on conversations surrounding the work of the Syria Civil Defense, also known as the White Helmets, a volunteer response group that works in rebel-held areas of Syria. This group does search and rescue and provides medical aid to people impacted by the civil war there. The White Helmets also document these impacts, often calling out the impacts of airstrikes by Syria's Russian allies and other atrocities such as chemical weapons attacks that have been perpetrated by the Syrian government. The tweet above, a recent one, actually specifically calls out the Assad regime's Russian allies and claims that they are specifically targeting aid workers for violence. This content that the White Helmets shared has served to some extent to garner solidarity and sympathy for the Syrian people from Western audiences. In 2016, they were the focus of an Oscar-winning documentary, which was part of what likely catalyzed a campaign against them. In 2017-18, when we first started studying this conversation, if you searched Twitter or Google for the White Helmets, you may have found some tweets or other content supporting them. But most likely you would have encountered content like this, content that challenges the White Helmets, claiming that they're a propaganda construct of the West, equating them with terrorists and calling them crisis actors. In our research in this conversation, I'm going to show you another graph, sorry I'll have to explain it again, but in our research on this conversation, we began again with a set of tweets, this time with White Helmets in it. And this is one representation of that data set, and I'll unpack a little bit for you. In the center of the graph is another retweet graph. So these are accounts that are So each node is an account, and this time it's sized by the number of retweets it receives. So the bigger accounts are more influential in that conversation. And they're connected to another account if they retweeted each other, if one retweeted the other. And as you can see here, this conversation is divided again into kind of two sides. Using a community detection algorithm, we identified two major clusters of accounts in the conversation: pro-white helmets in blue and anti-white helmets in red. As you can see, perhaps a little bit here, the red side is kind of dominating the conversation. So the anti-white helmets voices are much stronger and much louder and more prolific in this conversation. Their activity is persistent over time. Many of the same accounts repeatedly tweeting and retweeting content that specifically attacks the white helmets. They're literally drowning out the voices on the other side. And we can see them actively doing that in ways that's timed to kind of counter messages that the white helmets might have had. So who are these accounts on the right that are dominating the conversation? The top influencers, including self-described journalists, the top influencers include self-described journalists that consistently produce content aligned with the Syrian and Russian government interests. There are also officials from the Syrian government in this space, as well as some accounts from other governments. And there are a few of what seem to be inauthentic accounts that are likely paid or organizationally controlled troll accounts. And I mentioned a couple earlier in our earlier conversation. But inauthentic troll accounts actually don't constitute most of this graph. Most of the retweets are not coming from a troll or a bot or someone paid to participate. Most of the retweets here are coming from sincere activists who believe the content that they're sharing. So we didn't find, though we looked for them, we didn't find bots were contributing in a significant way. In fact, what we found were people who were activists, who many had been active in other kinds of political conversations, including anti-war activism. And these are real people who are sincere believers of the content they're sharing. In a lot of cases, they're people that are very much like us. In fact, some of the people that I'd studied in digital volunteerism, in other contexts, in the crisis response, are in the red side of this graph. And what are these accounts doing? They're participating in what looks very much like online activism. They share articles and videos that support their narratives and messages. They mention each other a lot. They whistle and then collectively dogpile content that supports the white helmets. It's actually how I first encountered them. I published a graph about the media involved in the conversation that showed that Russian media were supporting the conversation. And I got dogpiled by all of these people that came to yell at me in a way that I had never experienced before. These accounts and these activists are persistent. They tweet about the white helmets for months or even years. They activate at opportune times to capitalize on new information that can help them make their case, and also to distract from breaking news events that aren't aligned with their narratives. And they organize. In many ways, they look a lot like the online disaster volunteers I used to study, using Twitter and other platforms to meet, collect, coordinate, collaborate, recruit new members, and spread their messages. This is very much collaborative work. Around the outside of this graph is a different kind of node. These are web domains or websites that are linked to from the tweets shared by accounts in the center part of the graph. These domains are sized relative to the number of tweets that link to them. And they're colored according to the proportion of tweets coming from the red versus the blue sides of the graph. So the more red accounts on the outside are cited most by the anti-white helmets voices, and the blue accounts are sized by, nodes or domains or websites are posted more. There's not very many of them, but there's a few purple ones there that are cited a lot by the folks on the blue side of the graph. What you can see are a couple things. The first thing you might see here is that YouTube is a resource, especially for those who are participating in sort of the anti-white helmets part of the conversation. We're just starting to study that and unpack that, so I'm not going to share a lot of those findings here. But I want to focus on these two nodes, which are among the top domains in the conversation. One is RT, which is formerly Russia Today. The other is Sputnik News. Both domains are part of the Russian government's media and influence apparatus. In the white helmets conversation, these news domains provide content, including video content of the conflict. They also interviewed voices that share their objectives. They shape narratives. They amplify the voices of the anti-white helmets influencers. They repeatedly interview the journalists, the other influencers in these conversations. They bring them into their studios, they interview them, they raise their profile, they give them more of a voice and a reputation in the conversation. So you can see this kind of cross-promotion happening between Twitter and YouTube and these media outlets. And then the RT will share their video on YouTube, and then the activist that was interviewed will tweet it, and then they'll get retweeted all these times. So they're using all of these platforms together. There are other domains in pink that function as a kind of gray propaganda, consistently repeating the same kinds of narratives that we see on RT and Sputnik. And in some cases, the same anti-white helmets articles will appear at the same time across multiple domains because they're sort of astroturfing this content so people can discover it in different places, which I could talk about at the end if anyone's interested. So stepping back here, we see a persistent campaign of at least partially organic political activism supported by the Russian government's media apparatus and in alignment with their strategic objectives. This activity wasn't orchestrated like the IRA content we saw before, but it was cultivated. The Russian information apparatus amplified friendly voices, they provided a platform for journalists, they raised their profiles, and then they let their content flow through these gray propaganda sites, encouraging viewers to question more while spreading dozens of narratives that attempt to sow doubt about who the white helmets are and what they do. As I talked about a little bit earlier, this stuff is very effective. It was very effective on us, and I might get back to that, hopefully, if we have time. All right, for some reason, I'm talking too fast today, but I'm out of breath. All right, so I'm gonna go into the third case study. This one I'll go through a little bit faster. It's actually the first paper that we published on disinformation, and in some ways, we've been conducting this study for the longest period of time. So this is a study that looks at conspiracy theories as a vector of disinformation. In 2013, we actually embarked on our first study of online rumoring. We were looking at it in the 2013 Boston Marathon bombing data. And there was a lot of different rumors, but one kind of stuck out to us as being different from the others. So this was a tweet that was sent within a day of the bombings. It says, "Boston bombing smells like a CIA Black Ops false flag setup. Again, don't be fooled by the mainstream media lies." When we first encountered that, the language seemed so strange. I was like, what are these people talking about? What's a false flag, the mainstream media lie? Nowadays, this language, it's almost familiar to us. Just 5 years later, it's like, of course, that's what people say all the time. When we first saw it, we had no idea, why is anyone talking like this? So it was part of this, what we perceived as a very strange rumor, very different from the others that we'd studied, claiming the event hadn't happened as the media was describing, but that it was a false flag that was really perpetrated by the CIA or another shadowy element of the US government. Over time, we kept seeing the same kind of rumor in event after event after event. They would say that it was a false flag event with hidden perpetrators, or that it was a hoax event staged by crisis actors, that same word that we've now encountered over and over again in these other contexts. But back to this. Each new event spawned a new round of conspiracy theorizing, though the same themes would come up again and again. Western governments target their own people, the mainstream media lies, and one of the interesting things that was always interesting to us was that these rumors cited weird websites that at the time we hadn't heard of. So in 2013, those were simpler times, I had not heard of InfoWars, or which one is this one? Your Newswire, or Before It's News, or whatever it is. So in our other rumors, we kind of recognized most of the media, but in the conspiracy theory rumors, the citations were all these websites that we'd never heard of. And so we mapped out this space using user co-sharing patterns. So we took a bunch of data from Twitter data that mentioned shooting events in 2016, and we mapped out, and we took ones that said false flag, crisis actor, or hoax in it, and we mapped out the information space. And in this case, each node is a website. So each circle is a website, and they're held together if the same user sent a tweet linking to one website and another tweet linking to another website. And so then what you get a sense of is the kind of places that the same person might visit. And the edge gets stronger if more users shared to both sites. And so you get this kind of sense of what's going on. So here, the sites in red are ones that actively supported the conspiracy theorizing. The sites in blue are ones that actively tried to debunk this conspiracy theorizing and say it wasn't a false flag, these events are happening. And the ones in yellow were actually straight news articles that were cited by people in ways that supported conspiracy theorizing. So the yellow ones that are integrated into the red might sometimes put out a conspiracy article, but they're just part of the media diets of the people that were sharing these conspiracy theories. After creating the graph, I conducted content analysis of the different web domains, which I do not necessarily recommend. That analysis revealed that this ecosystem is supporting a variety of different conspiracy theories and pseudoscientific claims. They're critical of Western governments, they're anti-media, anti-science. The content consistently reflected populist or anti-globalist kinds of ideologies and had strong anti-Semitic themes. It also contained many and diverse claims about how power from people control world events, a sort of all-encompassing conspiracy theory through which each new event would be interpreted. And so these panels here are not that one panel appeared in each site, but each site usually had articles about all of these different things. So each site was sort of a clearinghouse of conspiracy theories. Another thing we noticed was the presence of state-controlled media and think tanks that were primarily in the red and yellow areas within the red area of the graph. These websites were resources for people sharing this conspiracy theory content. It included outlets from Russia, as well as some tied to the Iranian government and some others. And interestingly, this media ecosystem that I just showed has a strong overlap with the media ecosystem that shares anti-white helmets narratives as well. So there's a lot of overlap there. So this is an orchestrated activity, but in some ways, it's organic. So it's strategically cultivated and amplified. So what actually happens here in these conversations is that, how do I want to say this? That an event will happen and people will start talking about how it's another false flag event. They don't need the Russian government or someone else to tell them that it's a false flag event. The community itself already has this kind of way of seeing the world as all kind of controlled by these powerful people, where Western governments are bad and evil, and we have good criticism of Western governments, but these ideologies have sunk in where they're the absolute evil, and then each time an event happens, they just spin that event into these kinds of conspiracy theories. And they're not controlled by disinformation actors, but they're strategically cultivated and shaped by those actors, because these communities can become sort of vectors of disinformation. It's not hard to see how something like that content about the Boston Marathon bombing being a CIA black ops setup, to then someone kind of having ideologies about the deep, or accepting the theory of the deep state. It's not much of a stretch, because you're already kind of soft on those kinds of ideas and ideologies. And so you can see how this kind of community of conspiracy theorizing can be leveraged to spread different kinds of disinformation narratives. All right, so got through my case studies. All right, so using some of the material from those studies, and we can talk a little bit about them more at the end if people have questions, but I want to get into kind of talking about taking a step back and trying to stitch this together into our conceptualization of disinformation, and kind of think about how it is, what it is, how it works, why we're vulnerable, and why solutions aren't so simple. And I also want to do this without also being fatalistic and say there's no solution. So I want to get to that too, is that we should be able to think productively about this, but it's not going to be easy. All right, so the first thing is that disinformation is not simply false information. And sometimes it isn't false at all. To be effective, disinformation layers truth with lies, often building on a true or plausible core, but then adding new details and omitting others to shape a specific narrative towards a specific strategic objective, or to shape many narratives towards a specific strategic objective. In the IRA troll case, the troll accounts misled their audiences about who they were and what their intentions and motivations were. They attempted to shape political discourse and political action, voting, of the communities they infiltrated towards objectives that those communities were not aware of and likely didn't share. In the White Helmets case, we can see narratives like this one, built from factual information that the White Helmets and others provide about the funding they receive from Western governments, and also evidence of some of the things that they've done and been a part of in terms of after people are injured or after people are killed, they do body recovery. And so people take that information, and also they do all of that video, all the video that they do to help show about what the impacts are. So according to the activists in pink and the media that support them, the White Helmets are paid by Western governments to create propaganda meant to shape how people see the war. It's a compelling narrative that's hard to problematize as simply true or false. It's strategic. Another insight from this work is that we need to consider or reconsider our unit of analysis. It's not always effective to think of disinformation as a single piece of information or a single account, but instead to think of it as a campaign. Bittman uses that unit of analysis. Borrowing from his characterization and our analyses of modern disinformation, we agree that it's useful to think of disinformation not as a quality of a specific piece of information, but as a collection of information actions, or a campaign. Looking at the 2016 election interference in the US, we can see a multi-channel, multi-dimensional campaign. On the IRA side, we talked about Twitter, but the troll activity was multi-platform. They were on Facebook, they were on Instagram, they were commenting on web articles and forums, they were making and distributing playlists through SoundCloud. And this wasn't just a social media campaign or just the Internet Research Agency and its trolls. It also included the hacking and release of stolen emails that has been repeatedly associated with Russian hackers, the use of gray propaganda sites to push their narratives, and the manipulation of mainstream media to spread their content, to spread their stolen content especially, as well as the infiltration of other social and political organizations. For the white helmets example, it's not just a single piece of information or even a single narrative, but an array of diverse and sometimes even conflicting narratives that built into several connected ideas and ideologies, using Twitter and YouTube and in combination with connected media strategies across dozens of gray propaganda sites. This effort sought to undermine the white helmets, especially their efforts to garner sympathy from global audiences, but also to connect them to terrorists on one hand and narratives questioning Western intervention and challenging Western media on the other. I end with one of their more recent narratives, a tweet featuring an RT interview with a prominent journalist in this space, where she claims that the white helmets are trafficking in the organs of children. I'm going to leave that one there. For the case of conspiracy theories of crisis events, in part, these communities exist in a particular kind of information space or disinformation space, where the echo of old campaigns can be heard within a community that has developed an epistemology or a way of thinking about knowledge and information that renders them particularly vulnerable to additional disinformation that aligns with the meta-narratives of past disinformation campaigns. And we can see sort of the pervasive effects of disinformation in a community that becomes vulnerable to continued sort of use as a host for disinformation narratives. Considering these two together, as we turn to questions of detection, which is an important area of research, especially in online environments, this means that identifying disinformation isn't about determining the truth value of a specific post or the authenticity of a single account, but to think about how that post and account fit into a larger campaign where the underlying intent is to mislead for a strategic political purpose. In this view, disinformation remains disinformation regardless of who the intermediary is. A person does not need to be aware of their role in the campaign to be a participant. And this has very difficult implications for technology companies wanting to address the spread of disinformation on their platforms, because it's far easier to problematize and take action against a troll or a network of bots than it is against a sincere activist who believe what they're saying. And we wouldn't want platforms to take the same kind of action in those cases. This gets to the point that we highlighted in the title of this talk. A lot of research in this area has focused on detecting automated activity or bots and inauthentic activity or trolls. But disinformation isn't just about bots and trolls. As we can see in our studies, it targets, infiltrates, cultivates, shapes, and ultimately leverages online crowds and communities. Bittman talked about the role that unwitting agents played in historical disinformation campaigns. Here we can see agents working with, collaborating with, unwitting crowds to achieve their goals. I encourage researchers and platform designers not just to focus on the orange part of this graph on the left, but to look at the blue and the whole graph on the right, is to study how online communities are targeted and affected by disinformation, and how some members of those unwitting crowds take it up and make it their own, eventually generating their own propaganda-like messages that reflect the narratives of disinformation operatives. Once an effort takes root within an online community, the problem becomes much more difficult to address, as freedom of speech concerns by the platforms replace sort of bot and troll detection work. All right, I have a few more points, but this one is probably one of the most important ones, and again, we talked about this earlier in some conversations. We have a tendency to think that disinformation affects other people, and that we're somehow smarter or savvier or something. But I would contest that we're all vulnerable to disinformation. Disinformation works. It's profoundly disorienting by design. Our lab's been affected by this. I've been affected by it. It took me years to recover from the work that I did looking at the conspiracy theories of crisis events and the websites that carry that content. It was very disorienting. Within the Black Lives Matter conversation, the lead researcher on our team, Emmer, has talked extensively about how hard it was to see the IRA content that was targeted for people on the left side of the graph as even propaganda, because a lot of it aligned with how he saw the world. In the white helmets conversation, it took our researchers weeks and in some cases months to recognize that what we were seeing was disinformation. Much of it was targeted at people exactly like us, left-leaning, critical of US military intervention, from diverse and international backgrounds. And these things began to get easier as we began to map the relationships of different kind of media and to see how different media were shaping the conversations. And be able to see how they were connected to Russians' disinformation apparatus. But we were still left with lingering doubt about the white helmets and their mission, which was the whole point of the disinformation campaign. It didn't have to convince us that the white helmets were organ traders. All it had to do was give us enough doubt about the validity of who they were and what they were trying to do, that we didn't take action to pressure our governments to do something different about what was happening in Syria. And that was the point of that whole campaign. And though few of us here would call ourselves Sandy Hook deniers, I hope, we're all vulnerable to doing our own conspiracy theorizing from time to time. We're constantly looking for patterns, explanation, causation, and at times we over-attribute simple causal factors to more random or complex and chaotic systems. So this isn't about intelligence or mental health or some other kind of person. We're all vulnerable to this, and we have to be cognizant of that as we're interacting in information spaces. Looking beyond a single campaign, the pervasive use of disinformation has consequences for the societies experiencing it. One of those is diminished trust in information. We've talked a lot about that here. Disinformation reduces our ability to know whom and what to trust, with the idea that when people don't know where to go for information they can trust, they lose their agency, their ability to take decisions based on knowledge of the world. It's one of the theorized effects of pervasive disinformation. You can see this as both cause and effect within this kind of community. It reflects sort of a distrust of media, and it's also spreading that distrust of media. This account has been suspended, so I'm not actually sure it was an organic account now, but I've been using it for years. So we don't know if this is a person who's trying to make people distrust media, or this is a person who doesn't distrust it, and they're just sharing that. The IRA trolls played to this distrust. They directly attacked mainstream media in the US. This is a tweet from one of the prominent IRA trolls that was on the right side of our graph in the Black Lives Matter conversation. It was sent in 2017, and it was encouraging its audience to doubt media narratives. We see this sort of CNN is ISIS thing right here. It says that same phrase appears in the anti-white helmets content as well. CNN is ISIS, CNN is ISIS. So you can see this kind of like direct attack on media. But there's also a sort of second order indirect attack that disinformation does. Because it begins to, we tell people to be skeptical, we learn that we can't trust anything, and then all of a sudden, it's not just that they're telling us not to trust the media, it's like, we're learning that we can't trust things. So it's not just fake news or the mainstream media that we can't trust. It's also just about anything we encounter online. So I'm arguing with an account on Twitter. Maybe it's not a real person. That's a Russian troll. You're not a person. You're a Russian troll. You encounter an article with information that you don't like or you don't agree with. That's just fake news. And you don't. Yes. One of the things that this does is it, by giving us, even by my talks, giving evidence of Russian trolls in this space can be used by people to say, oh, therefore we shouldn't trust information, we shouldn't trust these systems. When I first saw the images of the Notre Dame Cathedral on fire, I thought it was a fake. I thought it was a deep fake. And so you can see that distrust is already kind of sinking into the ways we see the world. Let me skip this one. And so this loss of trust feeds into a more troubling point. Disinformation undermines democratic societies. It destabilizes the common ground that we need to stand upon to govern ourselves. It undermines our shared reality. We lose trust in information. We lose the confidence that we know what we know, and that things are as they seem. If you notice the positioning of these orange clusters here, they're on the outside of these communities, helping helping to pull these communities further apart. So that's empirical, maybe, I don't know, but it's definitely metaphorical, right? That disinformation tears at the social social fabric. It amplifies existing divisions, and if the divisions become too extreme, we can't come together to govern ourselves, and becomes a danger for democratic societies. So let's move on to, if we can, to solutions. I vowed in this year's talk not to end with like depression and like it's too big and it's not, and we can't solve it. And I actually have a story about this. I was on a panel 14 months ago, maybe 13. I was on a panel in DC and there was 4 of us there. And we were talking about the problem, and then people would ask questions. They're like, what about this? Oh, that's not gonna help. What about that? Nope, we can't, that's not gonna work because of this. Every idea, we just shot it down, and by the end of it, we're fatalistic. We can't, it's too hard, we can't solve it. And there was this guy, at the end of this conference, this guy comes up, he gets to summarize the conference. When we were at the last panel of the conference, so he comes up after us. And he is an older ambassador. He'd been around a long time, that's what he told us, and he definitely had that appearance. And he said, well, basically he scolded us. He said, you know, we've had problems in the past. We had like the nuclear clock was, well, it's about to run out again, but the nuclear clock was down to the seconds, like nuclear war was imminent. We had the Cold War, we had all these things. And we didn't say, oh my gosh, we can't solve this. No, we chipped away at the problem. We chipped away at the problem from different places, and then eventually, you know, that problem is gone and now we have new ones. And he said, you're not being fair to yourselves or anyone else by sitting up here and rejecting everything and being so fatalistic. And what we've got to do is figure out how to chip away at this problem. And that is where I am at this year. I'm also on sabbatical, so I'm in a better mood. I think we need to chip away. I think we need to chip away from many different perspectives. I think it's a hard problem. It's an interdisciplinary problem. We need to approach it from the design of technology. We need to approach it from education perspectives. We need to strengthen journalism so that the attacks on media don't resonate. We've got policy that needs to be worked out. So we need to approach these from all different sides. And I think it really is kind of an opportunity for people from all kinds of research perspectives to approach this, maybe come together, or approach this from your side to kind of work on what we might do. We can talk about different ones. I have different ideas in each of these areas. I do have an interest in discussing platform policy, if we want to discuss some of that at the end, but I'm going to leave it up to you during the question and answer to see what you might want to think about the most. And I really just want to end with this idea that we need to chip away as researchers. We need to think about, if you're interested in this space, there's plenty of room, and there's lots of open questions, and I think it's important for people from different perspectives to be thinking about different ways to contribute to solutions, and I am hopeful that we're going to solve things, even though in the day-to-day often it does seem a little daunting. All right, so thank you very much for your time and attention. I want to thank all my students who have contributed in many ways to all of this research, and one of them is on the job market, if anyone wants to talk about that. He's fantastic, and I'm sad he's currently running my lab, and I don't know what I'm gonna do without him. All right, thank you, and open it up for questions.
So I never do this, but I'm going to take the first question myself.
All right.
I'm dying to ask it. So I actually do want to talk about platform policy,
Yep.
but maybe at a high level. And I see very clearly now some connections between this work and some work I really recently did on Twitter, where I think sort of at the end of this project, what I realized was that maybe Twitter doesn't understand its platform very well. And the crux of the issue, I'm actually presenting at Twitter tomorrow, so
Awesome.
I'll go ask them, was that they seem to think it's about content and about information, and there's this timeline algorithm that kind of randomly does a mashup of stuff they think you'll like. And what we saw when people talked about that algorithm was that they were kind of losing connections with people on the platform. They were kind of losing the ability to participate in and build community the way they wanted to. And I see so many resonances here in what you're talking about in the way disinformation is manipulating social media, particularly Twitter, as a site of community building. And so I wonder, do you think Twitter understands that it is social media, that it is a space of community building? Is part of the problem with their policies that they're not addressing content moderation or content curation from the perspective that this is a place where people create community rather than this is a place where people consume content?
There's a lot there. I've just had a conversation right before this. My last one-on-one meeting today kind of was to talk about the capacity of Twitter to understand itself is perhaps lower than we think because they're constantly just trying to keep their platform going. And they don't make enough money to throw themselves at some of these things and have this kind of longer term thinking about who they are and what they are. I think your observation, I mean, a lot of these platforms have changed who they are over time, right? Like even Facebook, you know, they were thinking about themselves as the public square, and now they're trying to think about themselves as the living room or whatever. And Twitter, at a time, there was a time when I didn't think they did think about themselves as a place of online organizing. Right now, I think they're thinking about themselves as a place for news distribution, which might have a better, and for influence gaining and information to go out through influence in different ways, which is about information sharing and content sharing rather than about community building. And we talked earlier about the kinds of cues that we could give. One of the things we talked about in the conversation today that was really valuable for me was thinking about, for those people that are in the blue part of that graph, what kinds of information might they want to know, which might help them make different decisions so they don't end up in the pink part of the graph in the white helmets conversation? What part of, you know, what kinds of cues could we give them about who's in their network and who they should trust and who's going on there? But there's something about the distribution model. Oh, I saw this person retweeted that person, so I'll retweet them too. And we don't really have a sense of where our community's boundaries are, who we're interacting with in these spaces. And so really thinking about how maybe we give some different kinds, or to encourage Twitter to think about how they give different kinds of cues. But those are hard questions, and you have to have the resources and the ability to test them. And yeah, I'm going to be there on Thursday, so.
Oh, all right.
Yeah.
So I really enjoyed it. I really liked the graphs, and I liked the way you said that it's a campaign that sort of strategically tries to cultivate already existing communities or shape them in some way. So my question is really sort of about how, so when we say campaign, we sort of attribute to these actors, whoever it is, the Internet Research Agency or whoever, some kind of objective and strategy through
Yeah.
which they do this. And the way sort of you described it, the way that you said it's a long-term thing. So I go back to Adrian Chen's famous piece on the IRA, where it's like a big building, and he says people go and work there, and there's a bunch of clerks. I mean, this is kind of my word, but there's a bunch of low-level employees who tweet, and they are given instructions. So I guess this is a two-part question. What I'm asking is, how much coordination do you think the other side has to do something like this? Because it is such an open-ended strategic enterprise. How much sort of planning do we attribute to the other side, sort of the IRA? So that's my first question. The second question, now that I see all this, is that this seems to be a specifically US phenomenon. So all the three campaigns you had are sort of directed towards US voters.
Yes.
So did they just strike lucky? And is it the conditions of the US that make such a disinformation?
So let me step back and say why my case studies are what they are. One of those is we limited the case studies to English-speaking tweets, which means that we caught things about the US context, and we caught things occasionally about the British context. Two of these studies are based on data sets related to shooting events. Shooting events are kind of a US phenomenon. And so those highly shaped the things that we found. Disinformation is a global problem. Russia is participating in all sorts of different contexts. There's just a very fascinating paper that came out about their work that's looking at the Africa context and how they're manipulating conversations there using various different strategies. And Russia is by far not the only actor. We've got examples in Brazil, Philippines, things are happening in Central Europe. So I think it's, yeah, go ahead.
But like, what strategy do you think they start off with? Like, what do they
Yeah, so this is where looking at the historical accounts of what disinformation is and how it works has been really informative to us. That it works in long-term strategies. They actually have like a 7-year kind of thing where it's a 7-year plan. It is not as simple as votes. It's not as simple as candidates. They started to lay the foundations for what happened in 2016 long before they knew who the candidates would be. And so they also improvise a little bit. As they go, and we could see that happening in the IRA stuff. They tried a lot of things, and if they didn't work, they just left it behind, and they would try something else, and that worked, and so they would go with it. So it was improvised. Their directions were changing each week based on what was going on, and so if we consider it, the long-term plan is sowing division, sowing confusion, and undermining the West in this case. So there's other kinds of this undermining, democracy in the U.S. As both a distraction to what's going on in Russia and these are sort of the political theories of what's going on there. We can think about it as sort of the tactics are improvised in the day-to-day, but they're working towards these kind of long-term goals.
So much. I think I've been following your work and like Professor Spiro's work as well in this space. So one of the things I wanted to address was, has there been any experimentation to see, like experiments with certain affordances and platforms to see whether, like for instance, you said that research in education and research in like what platforms can do to provide cues is helpful, but we also see this pattern of cognitive dissonance play out where even if you suspect it's fake news, that primal emotion of it aligning with your existing beliefs wins out, and then you're like, I will share this anyway, even if I know it's not really it's possibly fake. Is there any like experimentation to see whether like giving them pause actually works? Or
Yeah, so there is lots of experimentation being done. The experiments are hard to do unless you're inside the company, and we don't know what the company is always doing. But there are folks that are trying to do experiments in different ways. They often rely on Mechanical Turk or something else, so they're not always perfectly ecologically valid. But the results are mixed. There are examples of like backfire effects from correcting. There's examples of making a fake label on some information not working. So we have some good signals now that the simple solutions of labeling things and giving those labels to users as they encounter the information probably not going to help a lot with the problem. We've been trying to think about testing or experimenting with, not we individually, I'm thinking we collectively. I've given these talks and I've had these conversations with other people, and I would encourage this because I know that the National Science Foundation, especially the SATC director, is really interested in thinking about other kinds of contextual cues. So can we give information to someone when we encounter an article? If you could give me information about where else that article appears, that would really help in the White Helmet's case. A lot of the articles, you might find it on a site that looks like something you would like, and then you find out actually it was first published on RT or something else. And by giving people kind of context of where else an article appears would be interesting. Or how a piece of information moves to you. How did it get to you? Not just where did it come from initially, but who did this bounce off of before it got to me? Oh, look, Mike Cernovich retweeted it 3 days ago, and then that got to someone else. And like, I know that person is sort of an alt-right troll, so I can make some determinations of how it might happen. So those kinds of things might help us. I saw it in my feed just yesterday, or maybe 2 days ago now. A person that I trust and I think highly of, retweeted something that the account it retweeted is in my read section. I'm pretty sure it's operated by a government or a political organization. It's a troll account, but this was a content about the Bolivia crisis and then something else. And the person is like, oh, but this is a really important narrative. I'm like, you are literally retweeting sort of a disinformation agent right now. I didn't say it in a mean way. I said it in a nice way, and they pulled the retweet. But I think if the systems could have given that person that information, I think it would have been really helpful. I don't think they would have retweeted it had they known where this person is or what other kinds of content that account has been involved in. And so how do we give us signals about where we are in those networks? So we can reflect on what our community looks like, who we can trust, who we can't trust, and whether this information is part of our community or coming from the outside or something else. Yeah.
I'd like to point out that I don't think this is limited to English language or to Twitter. Was there not some discussion of the use of Facebook in Myanmar to attack the Rohingya population?
Yeah.
And I do not have a Twitter account. I refused to get one after watching it for a short period. But I'm on Facebook, and I have occasionally, basically fact-checked the sources of things that my friends on Facebook have posted, and said, look, this is an extreme right-wing organization, or this is an extreme left-wing organization, but there's a limit to how much one person can do.
Yeah, no, it's, so one of the reasons that the main reason that this research is all about Twitter is that Twitter data is public and Facebook data is not public. We know that Facebook was involved in all of these campaigns. They're involved in all sorts of things. It is harder to study. And so when journalists and folks are particularly critical of Twitter, I like to point out that yes, we can be critical of Twitter, but let's not forget that the reason we're being critical of them is that because their data is public, not because these activities aren't happening in other places. And these are really important observations that misinformation and disinformation has been used in all sorts of ways in all sorts of other contexts. We are one research team, and just can't keep up with all the possibilities. We really encourage and would love to support others in doing similar kinds of research, but in other contexts and other languages as well. And in fact, one of the goals of our new center at the University of Washington we're setting up right now is to develop the infrastructure that we can support other researchers in doing this kind of work and maybe extend our methods and our tools to help them answer their questions. And that's actually a major goal of our center, is to kind of enhance the capacity of who can do this kind of research, because there's so many questions to ask right now, and one research team can't possibly keep up.
I was thinking, kind of in response to your question, Jenna, and also on the topic of chicken white solutions, I was wondering if you know of people that are exploring kind of community moderators, whether like they exist formally in places like Reddit. I'm actually involved in a project looking at that right now.
Yeah.
But maybe even on Twitter as well. So rather than targeting like the individual user, if you can identify like some real central nodes, then maybe that's a better.
One of the things I would love to see is thinking about that. Again, we've been talking about this all day, so I'm having new ideas. One of the things that I think would be really interesting would have been for like the Black Lives Matter organizing that was happening, if they had been given signals that these people were coming out of left field, that were entering, because they didn't look the same at first. They were totally separate. They weren't connected. And then once they got in for a while, then they kind of began to look similar, even though they never perfectly looked the same in some of the different metrics. And so if that movement had the ability to have some kind of they had influencers, but the influencers weren't necessarily moderators. And what would it mean for some of those influencers early on to have had signals about these other folks coming in from the side?
Yeah, I think almost like reframing this rather than like, how do we prevent there being disinformation from flowing through social media, but like, how do we empower communities to keep themselves?
Check themselves, yeah, to keep themselves safe, yeah. I think that's a great way to think about it.
This is a tiny question. I can't find the paper, but there was a movement among Black Lives Matter organizers using the phrase "your slip is showing" as a way to tag back what they consider to be troll accounts. I don't know if you saw those messages, and it seems that it didn't do enough to kind of pull it apart.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's ways
I think
to
they came in after our data set, so they would have been a little bit later than the stuff we were studying, but yeah, no, that's, that I should go relook that up and recall. Is there a paper about it? Okay.
find it somewhere on my computer.
It's what? It's on Slate. Okay. Oh, it's an article. Awesome. I will put in my notes.
So a question about how you conducted the research. Did you find a way to almost automate or find an algorithm for the digging you had to do to confirm or debunk whether one handle was a bot or not? And is that
So the only data set we have high certainty that something is a troll was for the ones that Twitter gave us the handles. Because Twitter was able to figure it out. Actually, Facebook had found a bunch of personas that it figured out were fake, and then told Twitter that those personas were also on Twitter. And then Twitter used those and spun it out. And that's how they found the IRA accounts. As an external researcher without that kind of IP metadata and other kinds of things, we don't have the ability to say certainly, and so to say with certainty what's going on in those spaces. And so in some ways, our research, we were able to do this sort of like systematic analysis of where they were in a way that, because we had the Black Lives Matter data, but without Twitter releasing that list, we would have never been able to do that study. So it speaks to, the companies are still releasing operations. They'll say that they're happening, but what happens is they release it, we don't have the data, we can't really see what happened, and they can even release the tweets, but we can't see who they were interacting with or anything else. And so these cases that we opportunistically had because we already had the data aren't easy to recreate in other contexts, unfortunately.
How much do you know about how Facebook and Twitter figured out that those accounts were the IRA accounts? Do you any clues? Do they give you any clues about like what it was that they were able to
about how they saw it? I know those folks, and they've mentioned it, but they haven't said exactly what their methods are. They're doing sort of threat intel. They have a threat intel team that does those sort of takedown things, and I don't know what signals they're using, but it probably involves IP addresses even more than any sort of coordinated action thing. I think that's what they have to do, yeah.
Hi, so first of all, thank you for these insights. And I have a question. I would be very interested in knowing your opinion on a thesis. I think that, well, has been pointed out by Helen Pluckrose, for example, that postmodernist or post-structuralist theorists have contributed largely to the situation we are right now in terms of disinformation.
So I will give an example, and I may be speaking orthogonally to this question, but hopefully I'll at least partially answer it. One of the things that I encountered when I was doing the research on the conspiracy theories of crisis events was that many of the websites that I would go to would use the language of critical thinking to draw people in. They would say, you know, you're a critical thinker, come to our site. We're gonna give you just the facts and you're gonna figure it out for yourself. Do your own research, here, come to our site to do your own research. And using sort of the methodologies and of critical thinking and sort of unpacking relationships and where does the funding come from, but not to make things, to identify institutions our weaknesses to build them up, but just to shatter them, to break everything down, to break down reality, to critique things until it's all broken and dashed on the floor, is how I talked about it. But and so you can see sort of this idea that there is no truth, there's no objective truth. You can't really know the truth, and that rhetoric as well has been used to be like, well, you can't know the truth, and therefore there is no truth. Therefore, this reality is just as good as that reality. That Sandy Hook. That children were killed at Sandy Hook versus Sandy Hook was staged by crisis actors. You can't know the truth. You weren't there. So therefore, A and B are equally valid. And I do see, I think it's the same thing as that critical thinking example, is that there's sort of an intentional leveraging of some of these ideas and ideologies to kind of spread this, like the truth is unknowable. And nothing's real, or everything is broken and illegitimate for whatever reason.
So can I add a comment to that? I would consider that an abuse of that kind of theory.
Yeah.
Just to.
Yeah.
I'm not going to stop teaching students to think critically.
No, I don't think. There's a great paper by Latour about matters of fact and matters of concern, and he talks about how we've taught people to do this critical thinking around science, and then people were using that to undermine the science of climate change. And he's like, we need to reframe it of like, we don't critique it just to tear it down. We can critique it because we care about it and we want to make it better. Well, we can think about the same for journalism. We should critique journalism. They get it wrong. They should be, they should not, they should be stronger. They need to figure out a way to foster more strong. They don't need to use clickbait. I mean, that's really undermining what they want to do. But we don't want to just dash it on the floor. We want to critique it to make it stronger. And so when I recognize that someone's just critiquing to break it down, that's for me a signal of someone who's either part of a disinformation campaign or someone who's been affected by this anti-epistemology. But we want to critique, but we don't, we want to critique to care rather than critique to destroy.
I have a really silly question, which is I'm curious with the profile images from the Black Lives Matter and the All Lives Matter. Mm-hmm. Do you know where they were from? And was there any reverse image search? Did that turn up anything?
You know what? I've thought about that. I was just thinking about that the other day. I was like, because I'm thinking about writing a book, and I actually want to trace down who those images are of. I'm sure there's stock photos at some level, but I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. If anyone finds the answer, please send it to me, because I don't, and I think it would be really interesting to trace down one of those stories. Whose photos were used for the IRA trolls?
It could have been generated, though.
I don't think they're not that fancy. They really are, like, we try to think, oh, they're doing this or that. They're really not that, They're what? They could be stock photos. They also had, they claimed, one of them claimed like a sorority, like she'd been a part of a sorority, and there's a picture of her in an African-American sorority, one of these things. So it's a person, but I don't know who it was. But it would be really interesting to figure it out. I'm sure someone's figured it out. I don't know what it is. It's a really good question. Hi.
So this made me think about how, as society becoming really polarized, and wondering if there's research showing what are terms or language or strategies that make people think about the other side or come together, if you're aware of that.
I wish I was going to be able to answer this in the direction that you're asking, because I actually don't know what the solution to polarization is. We probably should be looking at things like theories of forgiveness and other kinds of things, because I haven't seen a lot of examples of things that work for depolarization, and I know there are folks talking about it. I will say that on the opposite side, I've been watching this, I saw this really fascinating paper at CSCW last week about hashtag burnout, about how just the use of hashtags now is becoming, people are perceiving that as more partisan, less true, especially if a hashtag appears in a media article in the title. People will perceive that article as less credible and more partisan. And so the hashtag itself, and we had noticed that the hashtag, as it starts to get into the profiles of people's descriptions of themselves, it even marks this greater distinction of identity. And so we can see some of these things, not that the hashtag necessarily was polarizing, but it's become polarizing over time. And I think there were some really important open questions of how do we depolarize? I don't know the answer, but I'm not going to say that that's not there's no. I think there's possibilities. We just don't know. We don't know, or I don't know them. Maybe there's stuff out there.
Thank you. I just wanted to speak to that.
Yeah.
I know over the summer that Twitter was trying to test out this thing where they will try to show other opinions when you read increasingly. But like you said, a lot of research has been shown that there's backfire from that.
Yeah.
You're exposed to a radically different view, you become even more fixed in your stance post-exposure. So
They would send me some of the alt-right trolls in my feed, and that is not making things better. It reminds me of the example. My parents are in a echo chamber of sorts. They watch Fox News, and I was telling, trying to convince them to whatever, and they're like, "Oh no, we don't just watch Fox News anymore. We also watch MSNBC." And I was like, "Well, first of all, that's probably not great balance, but it's balanced, but it's not necessarily balanced to something neutral." And then I was like, well, tell me about that. I was like, well, when we watch Fox, like, yeah, that's all good stuff. But when we watch MSNBC, we know that's not good. We know it's not true because it's in MSNBC, right? Like, so they literally, like, they go over there and it's like Rachel Maddow is saying it and they don't like her. And so then they reject the information. And that's kind of what they found in this study is that when things are marked by these political identifiers of the other side and we're already polarized against them, by seeing that content doesn't make us come together, it actually makes us go apart, which is some of the things that we could see in some of our other research. It's like by enacting sort of these political caricatures of ourselves, that's part of the polarizing effect. And the trolls do that, but now we see people acting like trolls. Like, I think that's a real person, but they're mimicking the behavior of trolls. What'd you say?
I said they picked up the patterns.
Exactly. The exchange of social norms goes in both directions. It's like the troll is modeled after people, but then also people are modeling after trolls.
I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about sort of what you see, what solutions you see sort of lie on the platforms as opposed to which solutions belong more at the policy level. I think one thing that really scares me a little is thinking that like all of the solutions belong on the platforms and what happens if the platforms, I mean, I think about like Nazi Germany as this sort of example when companies, or I sort of think about this, but like what happens if Twitter gets co-opted by sort of the alt-right and all of a sudden they're silencing these other voices or something. So I was just curious to get your thoughts on where the solution lies.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard. I guess I can say I know that policy changes are coming. Well, they're coming in Europe first because they're already passing things, and they're thinking about how to do it. And there's also policy conversations happening in other places. I would not say that we want these platforms to be alone deciding the structure of modern society. And right now they're having these huge effects on things. Or I think they are huge. And they without sort of, in theory, we're a democratic society and we get to help govern ourselves. And we have these platforms that are so powerful and we have no say over what happens. So I don't want to think about the government controlling them. We think about we as a democratic society might want some influence in these platforms and how they shape the information that we see and everything else that's going on. We can see that they're intertwined with. So I do think that policy will be important. Right now in the US, it's so broken and the conversation is all, it's all about politicians trying to claim political bias and score political points in ways that's totally disingenuous to what the problems actually are. And so I'm not confident that right now our democracy has the capacity to pass the right laws. So that makes me nervous too. I'm also nervous about the future where the platform and the government becomes intertwined, which is one potential future too, and we're seeing that in other places, and that makes me nervous as well. So yes, I think policy should be part of the solution, but I think we somehow have to fix some of what's going on in our governing structures in order to get a healthy kind of policy. The good/bad news is that Europe's going to pass things, and because these platforms are global, they will shape what's going on in the platforms a little bit. We already can see that with the GDPR.
Another question might be tangential, but through your research, have you seen information burnout in general? So like, for example, I'm tired of watching news on all platforms. There's multiple like emails, Slack, WhatsApp. There's a lot of channels we have to receive information on and consolidate, and they seem to be increasing over time with social media.
Yeah.
I'm personally burnt out of that, and even as a professional, right? And so have you seen that trend? And if so, are people being desensitized? What does that look like?
I mean, there's just an article today out from the New York Times, I think, about that a little bit. I haven't studied that specifically. I do, in terms of like the misinformation burnout or the like overwhelmed by political disinformations to where people check out. It's been theorized that that is the point of disinformation, is to like so overwhelm our ability to make sense of information that we decide to back out of the conversations, that we lose our agency, and we just, because we can't make sense of things, we take ourselves out of the equation. And that has been theorized to lead to more sort of authoritarian power structures, because an authoritarian government will fill that hole when the people are unable to govern themselves. And so the theory of it is that this is maybe an effect of pervasive disinformation, and the goal, I don't know if it's just an accidental, happy accident of disinformation or not, but it is theorized as being part of what's going on. But I don't think I have seen like good empirical evidence that that's happening, although we might perceive it happening. So there's still work to be done to measure it.
We have time for like maybe one or two more questions, so
Maybe one, the way I answered them.
especially if anyone who hasn't had a chance to ask a question has one. Or we could stop right on.
All right, excellent.
Thank you very much, Professor.
All right, thank you all. Thank you all. That's such an awesome day, and some of the ideas that we've been talking about are really I'm gonna carry them forward. So just thank you for inviting me, and thank you all for your attention and all your great questions. So thanks. I don't know why. Yeah.
What was the paper about Africa and Russian bots that you
So it just came out 2 weeks ago. It came out of the Stanford Cyber Policy Center. It's a white paper.
Oh, cool.
They've had 2 papers out. One is about specifically